All right. So I am presenting on a project which will hopefully be a manuscript soon, but it's a study looking at the context preceding suicidal ideation. Uh, I'm at the University of Louisville. My name is Jonah Hickman, and I'm advised by Dr. Nadia Al-Dajani. Um, but the data for this project is coming from the University of Toronto, along with our collaborator over there, Dr. Eliasek. And before I really get into the nuts and the bolts of the study, I feel the need to make a bid for why it's important. Specifically because there are approximately 50,000 deaths by suicide each year. And that is not a statistic to gawk at, but in as much as that statistic is often presented alone, I feel the need to contextualize that in the suicidal process rather than just looking at the outcome. Specifically, in 2024, we see that for every one individual who dies by suicide, we have 292 individuals upstream from a suicide death, seriously considering suicide, which is also a big public health concern and signals that 14 million Americans are in significant distress in their daily life. And so research on some of these upstream elements is important because lots of our prevention efforts need to happen usually upstream, I would argue. And once you start looking into suicidal thoughts, independent of some of these other elements, you start to wonder if we really know what we think we know, which is concerning. We of course have existing theories and conceptualizations of what suicidal ideation is and what causes it, but you start to realize the more and more papers that you read that a lot of this data is coming from one or two maybe flawed methodologies. And I'll elaborate on this really quickly. This is an excerpt from a suicide note from a 1968 study. It says, it is hard to say why you don't want to live. I have only one real reason. The three people I have in the world which I love don't want me. And it is excerpts from suicide notes like this that have been used for decades in suicide research. It is a great source of information for sort of the suicidal thoughts that motivated the action. Specifically, we look at theories like the interpersonal theory of suicide, and this quote fits in perfectly. We have hopelessness, we have thwarted belongingness, we have perceived burdensomeness, and it's overwhelmingly this interpersonal cause of suicidal thinking. The one problem with using things like suicide notes as a lot of your data points for theory creation, for empiricism, is that suicidal ideation emerges and remits throughout days, weeks, months, etc. And so these cross-sectional accounts treat it as a trait-like variable, which may not be accurate. If it's emerging and remitting once every couple of days, sure, it could be due to the one cause that you sample at one time point, but it also might be caused by several different things, which up until recently wasn't really a consideration. We may accurately be able to derive some themes from this type of research. So when a note is written, in this one case, we could say that it came from a sense of loneliness, interpersonal rejection, and it may be true that that existed in the months preceding the note being written. But if we're treating suicidal ideation more recently as a state-like trait, we want to make sure that we have all of the things that contributed to suicidal ideation and its maintenance, because it's not likely that a single thing is causing suicidal thinking. It's probably more complex, and it probably involves an interaction between lots of different variables. And we maybe haven't been able to capture that always. Specifically because a lot of research is highly retrospective. I couldn't tell you what I ate for breakfast 2 days ago, let alone asking our participants the cause and content of a suicidal ideation episode they experienced a week, a month, or a year ago. Furthermore, a meta-analysis from 2014 suggests that there's some autobiographical memory limitations among individuals who are chronically suicidal, where their retelling of memories are perhaps very general, which would suggest we're losing a lot of detail, and therefore our understanding of what causes suicidal ideation might also be limited. So, with the current study, we were looking to point the field potentially in a different direction by using an EMA design to sample what situations prompted suicidal ideation. This is not likely the first EMA design to look at suicidal ideation, but it's unique in that it allowed participants to tell us what was going on in a pretty free response way. And I'll get into that here in a minute. The second aim is that since we have this time element and we know that it changes over time, how do the causes of suicidal ideation change over time? What are the patterns within suicidality? Oh, I'm not suicidality, suicidal thoughts. So we recruited a relatively small sample of community participants with suicidal ideation in the preceding 2 weeks before we recruited them. And they downloaded an app. We prompted them a couple of times a day, and if they had experienced suicidal thoughts since we last prompted them, we asked them to tell us about it, specifically what had caused or led to their suicidal thinking. Notably, they could also self-initiate if they were feeling suicidal and remembered that we were interested in that. But this led to us getting a lot of data, 289 suicidal ideation events among all of our participants, of which only 267 had text responses, which meant that we had about a suicidal ideation episode about every 2 days. But since it was a free response and we didn't prompt them in any which way of what things might be motivating their suicidal thinking, it meant that we had a lot of really rich qualitative data. So we took those raw text responses that we received, and myself and 2 of my other co-authors did an initial pass and identified some of the general themes therein. From that, we developed sort of a general initial structure of what most suicidal ideation events that we observed were and their causes. And after that, we trained our other 2 co-authors on a coding manual. And they went through and they double coded everything using those theme structures as a guiding framework. They were noting more detailed sub-elements, however, and so there were a couple sub-themes that we added as this was ongoing, but it didn't affect reliability because they were already noting some of these details along the way. This led to a higher order and lower order structure, where we have 3 overarching themes, and within those, a couple sub-themes for each category. I really quickly want to highlight that even though earlier I was suggesting that things like the interpersonal theory of suicide may be rooted in a methodology that has bias, that doesn't necessarily mean that we weren't going to see this element in this research. In fact, I would argue that the empiricism since the introduction of the interpersonal theory of suicide has really borne out that it has some epistemological veracity. But there's some nuances here for the interpersonal distress category, along with these other themes that were interesting. So I'm going to just really quickly highlight each of these and then talk about their patterns over time. Our most dominant theme was this emotional cognitive distress realm, where about 50% of all suicidal ideation events had this theme. It had sub-elements of depression, fatigue, which were sort of like a low arousal distress, high arousal distress for some individuals where there's a lot of anxiety, frustration, driving suicidal thinking. And then we had sort of this existential or motivational distress where people just felt like there was nothing really worth living or that things were just going to continue to get worse. So that was our biggest category. The next largest category was externally derived distress, which accounts for external causes of suicidal thinking, like tumultuous finances, issues with like medical procedures or getting help for medical pain, being stressed at your job, and activities of daily living. Notably, though, separate from the activities of daily living category, distress from health issues was a substantial subcategory separate from those. People were really worried about their worsening physical health and their ability to get help for it. And there's been a few other publications recently that have highlighted this domain, and so it was interesting that it popped up again. And this was present in an average of about 37% of suicidal ideation events. Then finally, we had sort of this IPTS category of interpersonal situations causing suicidal ideation. Interestingly enough, the subcategories here had more to do with who the target or actor was in the interaction. So it was either a romantic subject that someone was having disputes with, or a non-romantic subject that someone was having interactions with. And, anecdotally, I felt like they tended to stick to their category. But beyond that, the sort of distress elicited by the conflict or disagreement was pretty similar. But below these other events or these other themes that I've identified up to this point, this was only present in about 32% of suicidal ideation events, only about a third. So after we had those initial themes, we wanted to know if they were occurring at the same time or if they were occurring singularly or monothematically. We use logistic generalized linear mixed models, which I'm happy to go into the math on that if someone is interested. But we pretty much were able to get the likelihood that themes either co-occurred or occurred in isolation during any given suicidal ideation event. And what we ended up finding is that for any suicidal ideation event, if we used sort of all of just the sub-themes, there was a 78% chance that a theme was just existing alone. And if we move to that broader category, there's an 84% chance. So people are more than likely to only have one overarching theme driving their suicidal ideation. After this, we also wanted to know how these changed over time, looking at the previous two events and seeing if the themes that someone was experiencing was changing, which might signal like a multitude of things that we need to consider when treating these individuals. And what we ended up finding is that more often than not, especially when we look across multiple events, themes are likely to change. At the next event, there's a 61 to 74% chance that the themes we observe are different than the ones that we saw initially. And then when we look at the next two events, it goes up to 86 to 96%. So, summarizing all of these sort of quantitative findings, suicidal ideation may come from a predominantly emotional, cognitive, external, or interpersonal context, but then we can expect each category to probably exist independent of the other categories. It's likely just a single cause. And then finally, when we have identified that cause, it's likely to change every couple of days or every couple ideation events, which has significant implications for both research and clinical work. For research, it suggests that we need better research because better research and theories require us to assume things correctly. If we assume that suicidal ideation is one thing and it behaves completely different in reality, then all of the downstream effects of suicidal ideation, like planning, attempts, and deaths, might be a little bit off. And we don't always know the extent that that inaccuracy carries, the extent of error that that inaccuracy carries. So making sure that we have our base level secure in suicidal ideation research is very important. The clinical implications of this, I think, are especially interesting. Specifically, that we may not know our clients' suicidal experiences throughout the week because we're only meeting with them usually once a week. And so we're going to probably see one theme of suicidal ideation if they're telling us about it. And then after that, we probably don't know what it looks like. Are they experiencing the same type of suicidal ideation, or is it being caused by other things? Similarly, when we do risk assessments, we're only capturing a single cause in many cases, unless we're seeing them tons and tons and tons of times and we have the chance to see all of the different causes pop up. we're only going to know about maybe one cause, which means that when we're assessing risk and the potential for something to pop up in their week that would elevate them for a suicide attempt, we may not know what's going on there or if our risk assessment is accurate. Then finally, and I know I'm running out of time, but I think it's important to note that this is a study of clients' perceptions, of subjective perceptions of what had caused their suicidal ideation. There may very well be a different objective reason for suicidal thinking, but when we are treating individuals, we need to assess, are we treating the subjective experience or are we treating the objective experience? And maybe there's a middle ground between those two that can inform clinical care. This study was not without limitations. It was a small sample size, ethno-racially homogeneous, and there are some elements to the statistical modeling that are not perfect, especially when you're looking at probabilities over time. But I think that this project has a lot of merit, and I think that it is a good direction for future research. We're grateful for everyone involved. References are here, but you can also scan the QR code, and we thank you for your time.